Hey, foreshadowing is not good writing, but it can be. Everyone loves a good reveal, but even more than that, everyone loves rewatching their favorite series and just constantly pointing at the screen because it's right there. The answers are right in front of you the entire time. They had planned the whole thing out and I didn't even realize. Except, that's almost certainly not true. Because the word retcon, much like the forbidden F word, has been turned into just a meaningless buzzword, I think it's worth focusing on what it actually is. The term retcon is simply shorthand for retroactive continuity. In other words, continuity, or just a moment in the story, has in some way been adjusted or changed beyond its original publication. If Chapter 1 describes how it's raining, but Chapter 100 says that rain doesn't exist, that's a retcon, but much more importantly, it's a retcon that breaks canon. It's this distinction that I think is completely lost in most online discussion. A retcon does not imply breaking canon. If Chapter 100 says that it was in fact not rain, but a weird alien superweapon with like some kind of weird water droplet technology, that can be a retcon, but it does not break canon. One of them is a bad retcon that, for whatever reason, ignores the rules of the world and makes retroactive changes. The other is a retcon that simply recontextualizes that same world. It's obviously up to the reader to decide whether said recontextualization is good or not, which we will do in just a moment, but again, it in no way breaks canon. And this is where the eternal question pops up. Is explaining something even a retcon? Before we get to settling this debate, there is more lore recap. One of the greatest analogies that capture the writing process, I think, comes from George R. R. Martin, with him describing two distinct approaches to writing: the architect and the gardener. An architect is an author who plans everything. Just like an architect would do with a real building, they map out the foundation and the world building, they map out the individual actors and their plot points, they map out the core themes and the interplay between all of them. They have a clear blueprint before ever putting pen to paper. The most extreme example here would probably be Tolkien. Years and years of work went into the world building of Middle-earth, including a language and literally like thousands of years of history and whatnot, but there was never any kind of singular narrative for even years after that. Many detective and like murder mystery stories will also naturally have an architect approach simply due to the nature of their work. There are a few examples of murder mystery stories where the actual killer is introduced in like the back half of the book, but still, even that requires a lot of planning and a lot of setup to actually do right. For the most part, any kind of mystery kind of needs a plan around it. Gardeners, on the other hand, are authors who have a general idea or a seed of a story, but they let it grow organically as they write. They are basically exploring and discovering their own story along the way. George R. R. Martin identifies himself as a gardener in his writing process and has repeatedly talked about how his original ideas eventually evolved into something entirely new simply by the nature of his approach. Realistically, every author is of course somewhere in the middle. Many gardeners will know exactly how their story is going to end, and many architects will allow for this natural growth in the middle parts of the story. But I think the analogy gets the message across. I think the problem with these discussions is that a lot of people imagine that every quote-unquote good author is an architect with a clear blueprint. But if you actually read about these things, a book series like A Song of Ice and Fire is filled to the brim with foreshadowing, yet George himself admits that he doesn't really know exactly how it's all going to play out. This idea that every successful author is planning out literally everything is just plain not real. And what I think reveals that is the one very important detail that George doesn't really talk about in his analogy.
Money!
Basically, every single story we talk about on the internet is a product, first and foremost. The artistic expression is, unfortunately, almost always secondary. Authors like George can become successful enough that they can pick and choose what they want to work on. So George can be a gardener and discover how his story will end, even if that takes a literal decade. But when you have the biggest show on the planet, the adaptation of that same material, you don't have that luxury. Employing hundreds of people, maintaining the sets, and all of these different real-world circumstances make this kind of exploratory approach next to impossible. So when we talk about authors having these grand plans and how they plan out everything and that retcons are big bad, remember that we are discussing most of this in the confines of money. You're not going to set up foreshadowing for season 5 of a TV show if you're not even sure you're getting a season 2, right? That's why a lot of architect stories are usually pretty small in scope. If you're going to plan out everything in meticulous detail, it's not going to be left open-ended or take years and years and years by design. Realistically, no author expects to have the privilege of working on the same IP for years and years and years. So simply because of the constraints of the real world, many successful authors kind of become gardeners by default. So with that in mind, I want to really zero in on what it actually means to deliver a good narrative with satisfying foreshadowing and payoffs that will leave you screaming at the screen. Well, one way of doing that is just a big spreadsheet with every single clue already laid out in advance. If you know exactly how every plot device will work in the narrative, you can obviously shape the rest of said narrative around those plot devices. If you know none of it is going to change, all of that foreshadowing will be ironclad. Obligatory Chekhov's gun mention is a storytelling principle where every single plot device must come into play, otherwise it should not have been there. So the titular gun on the wall will be fired, otherwise why is it hanging there? A volcano must erupt, otherwise it could have just been a mountain. There are no misdirects, no false promises, everything is closely intertwined with one singular goal. This is what an architect is basically dealing with. A series of concrete plot points that can always be used as foreshadowing for the finale. Pretty much by default, that will mean that there is a satisfying through line that will make the final reveal at least feel earned. Now, importantly, that still doesn't mean that it's quote-unquote good writing or that it's even going to be very good. It just means that there is a clear plan. It's still impressive, sure, but the actual quality of the plan and all of that foreshadowing is still entirely dependent on the execution. If we go another layer deeper with analogies, you can think of it like cooking based on a recipe versus cooking entirely by ear. An inexperienced chef will, on average, do infinitely better with a recipe, or the architect approach. A recipe will help, but it can only carry you so far. An experienced chef, on the other hand, yeah, they'll have a few recipes memorized, but they can also improvise the entire way through, and the best part is that you never know. All of this is to say that a good author isn't defined by a set plan, but rather by their ability to convince you that this moment was inevitable all along. A good reveal will feel so meticulously placed that imagining the story without it should feel impossible. Not even because there were explicit breadcrumbs left along the way, but rather because the world of the narrative itself almost demands it. As paradoxical as it may seem, even a reveal that is meant to entirely subvert your expectations should still feel like it was meant to be there all along, like it was inevitable. A good author is defined by this ability to mold your perception of the story, something that becomes infinitely harder to do the longer the story goes on. With every single new character, with every single new event in the story, the overall complexity does not increase by just that one increment. It compounds over time because it must now fit into the already very messy puzzle. And so, what is harder? Planning it all out right from the get-go, or actually changing things on the fly? I think to best illustrate what all this is about, it's a good idea to look at a few different stories that occupy different mediums. And let's start with a favorite for the channel, Attack on Titan. The title of the very first episode is basically the only one in the series, which makes literally no sense. And that's because it's 100% foreshadowing something that will only become clear well into the final season. Massive steamy titans within the walls and super early mentions of an Emir make it blatantly clear that we are dealing in Norse and that all of this is about a form of Ragnarok. All the talk of a goddess Emir too matches up perfectly with Norse lore, but again, all of this would only become clear well into the final season. Language, saltwater fish, and even the lack of coffee on the island all foreshadow the true nature of the world, and the list just goes on. Attack on Titan is pretty much an architect story through and through. There are a couple of teeny tiny inconsistencies, some of which are anime-only adaptation inconsistencies, while others happen because Isayama still seem to be changing a few designs on the go, but by and large, the blueprint was always there. It was almost certainly somewhat expanded on once the series became incredibly popular, and Isayama realized that he just doesn't really need to rush all these individual plot points. But again, the underlying structure and the end goal of the series was there from day one. And it's that meticulous attention to detail that made it the one-in-a-lifetime experience that it was. There's a good reason why I've spent the better part of 3 years dissecting it on the channel. The interconnectedness of the story is mind-boggling, and there are very few shows with such replayability. That being said, the 60, 30 plus minute long videos I've made on the series aren't just a fun list of foreshadowing details. They are fun, yes, but what made the series successful is not the foreshadowing, it's the execution. The mystery is only there to keep you asking questions, but the series itself is a constant dance with the viewer. The outside world, for instance. Sure, picking up all the clues along the way and figuring out the answer beforehand is very cool, but what sticks with you is this. A scene that is not about foreshadowing. It's a scene that cuts right through the show itself. A scene of a horrible, horrible man staring right through the camera at us. He tells us that people actually crave violence and that it's interesting. Moments before, we will cheer at violence. You take away all the foreshadowing and nothing changes. It's still a perfect encapsulation of the series' themes. This series is about challenging the viewer's perceptions at just about every turn. The foreshadowing and all the mysteries are just the thing that keeps you asking questions. Even in a true architect story, foreshadowing doesn't make good writing. It just means you planned it out. You still need to execute. That is what makes you a good storyteller, not memorizing a spreadsheet of clues. For a completely different example, let's look to Breaking Bad, another masterclass in storytelling, a lot of which was not planned out at all and was just happy filmmaking accidents. Walter's signature crown, not intentional at all. Cranston's head was burning in the sun, so they gave him a hat for the outdoor scenes. But soon enough, it became an icon and was specifically written as this incredibly powerful symbol that, in hindsight, was always there. That retroactively becomes foreshadowing. Everyone's beloved Mike didn't exist. Saul's actor was unavailable for shooting that day because he was on set for How I Met Your Mother, so they made him up. Soon enough, his character is expanded to be a private eye for Saul, that is then expanded to be Gus's cleaner, and in Better Call Saul, there are entire episodes detailing a story just as rich as Walter's. None of it was planned in advance. It was just meticulous attention to detail that was applied retroactively to make everything fit. Ditto for Saul himself. I mean, learning of his true nature in Better Call Saul is just retcon the show, and that's what makes it amazing. Absolutely everything he does in Breaking Bad is seen in an entirely new light after having seen Better Call Saul. And all of those teeny tiny bits of characterization become foreshadowing retroactively. The point I'm getting across is that with any story that is primarily shot in live action, there will be hundreds of practical factors at play that will inevitably make changes. That's the beautiful side of filmmaking. Something like Walter's hat suddenly becoming an icon is a perfect example of how art is greater than the sum of its parts. Sometimes even the best, most thought-out plan is superseded by a complete accident. That doesn't mean there is no intent behind it and everything just happens by dumb luck. Absolutely not. It just means that the filmmakers are confident enough to adapt their vision on the fly. They can work with whatever tools they have and deliver something that sells the illusion of there being a true grand design behind it. Breaking Bad wasn't made good because it had recurring symbols or the galaxy brain foreshadowing of Season 2. It was great because it efficiently used every single tool at its disposal to immerse us in an experience and make us forget about all of those real-world limitations entirely. Jesse was originally supposed to die? No way. And in Season 2 the house was sold causing a bunch of weird rewrites? Nah. Mike doesn't exist? Not possible. Hank was supposed to die in Season 1? Ain't no way. Foreshadowing and planning does not mean good writing. It's just a plan. And you know what they say about plans and getting punched in the mouth. And the final series I want to talk about is actually the one that solidified this video's idea in the first place. One Piece. Out of just about any series I've ever followed, I think One Piece fans have I'll say, slightly bizarre interpretation of how Oda does setup and payoff. Fact of the matter is, a vast majority of early days One Piece will be retconned to hell and back for one very simple reason. There is not a single author on this planet confident and frankly arrogant enough to sit down and say, yeah, this goofy pirate manga will get 30 years of serialization. So today, I'll actually start foreshadowing an old god Tolkien-esque Norse mythos 25 years into the future. Oda's single greatest strength that has turned One Piece into the juggernaut that it is his ability to plant those seeds and let them grow for as long as he needs to. For the better part of 3 decades, he has subtly altered our perceptions of the entire universe to continuously expand on details that originally might have been unimportant, but they are all eventually spun into something incredible. Just saying that he had planned all of this in advance, I think sells his writing ability way short. What's actually impressive is continuously and repeatedly retconning and reshaping details around the story in a way that doesn't conflict with the 20 plus years of the story that exists beforehand. To give you a few concrete examples, Silhouette Piece is a meme for a reason. Literally none of them ever match the character, like, seriously at all. The most likely reason for that is just because it allows Oda to workshop the design right up until the deadline and really zero in on what the story needs at that point in time. Literally the goofiest looking silhouette of all time can instantly become literally the coolest thing ever just because Oda decided that, yeah, you know what, we'll actually be doing this in the story and this will be important. In the anime, this is of course even more pronounced and some of the designs are just plain wrong, but that's an adaptation thing, that's not super important. The original vision for the story was just a story about fighting the 4 emperors. The 7 warlords as we know them today didn't exist, but just think about the compounding impact they have had on the story. Introducing new characters is one thing, but to weave them all throughout the rest of the story is an entirely different conversation. That is not planning and foreshadowing. That is an incredible ability to retcon and let the story grow organically. The Worst Generation also didn't exist. Oda invented them after his editors told him the climax of the arc felt a little boring. And again, imagine the story without Law, or Bonnie, or Kid. Imagine how that changes post-war, Doflamingo's story, the Egghead story. The compounding impact of all of these additions cannot be understated. This ability to constantly adapt is not because Oda had a spreadsheet of plans. It was because he truly understood the vision and the message of his own world and was able to continuously adapt it. The strongest examples of this in recent memory, I think, are Gear 5 and, more recently, what we've learned about Shanks. I think the both of them are massive retcons. You know what I also think? I think the both of them are also excellent. With Luffy's fruit, it was always a paramecia. He himself called out his moves as Gum Gum, clearly named after his own fruits. For the entire series, when he talks about his fruit, he calls it the Gum Gum fruit. And with just about every other character, once they get their abilities, it seems that they innately know what the fruit is and what the abilities are. The awakening of his power is also odd, as it exhibits both the properties of a paramecia, with him reshaping his environments, as well as a zone with him turning into a mythical being. In other words, it had to retroactively make sense with the Gum Gum fruit he supposedly had, as it otherwise just doesn't align with any other zone. I could go on, but none of that matters because Oda made it work. All throughout the story, there are tidbits of old saviors and of old liberators, of old religions worshipping the sun and freedom, old dances and songs passed down from generation to generation. Oda let those seeds grow and grow for years in the background, until finally, he realized it's time to harvest. He pulled all of these details together and conceptualized an infinitely grander narrative that, in hindsight, looks like it was always there. If you're up to date with the manga, we're about to see this happen again. And that's what this entire video has been about. The best retcons look like they were foreshadowed, like they were always there, even if they practically couldn't have been. Oda's writing is the art of this retroactive narrative surgery. Most authors can create a spreadsheet of clues and drop it throughout the story. What most authors can't do is break their own world wide open 10 years into serialization and meticulously reconstruct it in a way that it's even bigger than before and no one sees the wounds. And now imagine doing that over and over and over, with every single big reveal having to essentially rewrite the entire 30-year-long story retroactively. There is a very good reason why Oda has joked about using fan wikis. That is an insane thing to do. Same goes for Shanks. When we met him, he was a cool pirate who entrusted a young boy with a hatch and gave him a dream. Was he an Emperor of the Sea who somehow ended up on the infamous island of God Valley as a baby, but that no longer exists because it was vaporized by an ancient shadow government, and he's actually intertwined with the God Knights because his brother is a part of it, and that actually goes all the way back 800 years to another ancient war that is literally erased a part of history, and a legendary figure by the name of Joy Boy emerged, and Shanks actually knows about it? Probably not, but somehow, chapter 1100 something rolls around, and I believe he was. The hat, the sacrifice of his arm, the hockey, the fact that he's friends with Luffy in the first place, it's somehow all foreshadowing. The world of One Piece has never been chained to old notes or plans. Oda has taken us on this grand journey where he repeatedly lies to us, in a good way, kind of like a magic trick, and then he hands us a new truth so convincing that we clap for the deception. So when people praise the insane foreshadowing of Goda, I think it's kind of missing the point and not actually the compliment that people think it is. The real magic isn't the plan or the foreshadowing, it's the retcon. The sheer audacity to add, reshape, twist, and expand that sandbox for literal decades, all the while juggling the rules of the world and keeping it all coherent and, most of all, fun. Oda did something much better than simply plan. He made you believe he did. And that is far more impressive than any breadcrumb trail could be. Wait a minute, if a retcon creates foreshadowing, is that foreshadowing the retcon, or is the retcon the foreshadowing that has been created by the nature of retconning, which in turn has created new foreshadowing toward the retcon which it created in the first place? Jokes aside, what I want to get across with this entire video is that a retcon is not a bad thing. They only get a bad rap because people associate it with poor writing that requires retcons to fix said poor writing. Ultimately, whether a story is meticulously planned or allowed to grow organically or even completely made up on the spot, the true measure of good writing isn't about this rigid adherence to some blueprint that builds up a reveal. Truly good writing is based on the author's ability to mold your perceptions of the story and make every reveal, even the totally unexpected ones, feel deeply engraved in the existing narrative. A great author will plan, but a great author also knows when to simply convince you that their new ideas were actually planned all along. And that's the video. This is a topic I've been talking about on stream for feels like years now, so I'm glad to have finally put out a main channel video about this. For the longest time, I've seen people have like this visceral reaction to like the word filler, which that's a whole different can of worms. People don't even know what it means. I made an Avatar video about it. And retcon is the same thing. People automatically assume that this is like a bad thing, you're dunking on the author or whatever, but no, stories are about deception and about immersion. It doesn't matter whether it was planned or not. If anything, coming up with everything on the spot, that's like a masterful bit of storytelling. That's literally like sitting with your friends around a campfire and just telling a immersive story. That is the pinnacle of storytelling. But anyway, this is supposed to be the outro, no more rants. So with that, I want to say a massive thank you to our current patrons and YouTube members who allow me to produce even more of these for you all. Without you, there'd be a whole lot less of my ramblings, so seriously, thank you. Especially now that it seems like the internet itself might be banned in like 3 days or something. Like, I don't know what's going on. Other than that, I want to say thank you very much for watching. I hope you have a great day, and hopefully, I'll see you in the next one. Bye-bye. Also, you don't know if this is a retcon or not because I started making them weirder and weirder recently. Or did I? Because they've always been weird. Is that a retcon? I don't know.